been making a few videos recently about the feelings that accompany certain cognitive states and cognitive behaviours. So I talked about the feeling of meaning, I talked about the feeling of knowing, I talked a little bit about the feeling of what happens coming out of Damasio, and a little bit about the feeling of free will, or the feeling of what happens next, borrowing off Rodolfo Linas. And all these ideas are to do with the idea that, what could be a completely uninflected piece of cognitive machinery in operation, just the manipulation of symbols in the brain, is actually accompanied by something we call a feeling, which gives it its subjective component, really, and makes it compelling, makes it real for us, if you like. And what I'm thinking of today, I think this might help me to provide me with a way into talking in more detail about it, is trying to link it up with some stuff I've been thinking about in terms of morality, and the feeling of what's right and the feeling of what's wrong. Because I think, in a sense, the same thing applies to morality and right and wrong as applies to those other things like knowing and meaning. That it's certainly possible to describe moral precepts purely in symbolic terms. I can write a code book, I can write a book of laws, which just lays out what's right and what's wrong. And I could, in theory, I suppose, input those laws and rules into some kind of a machine, and it just did the right thing. That's it. We just follow the laws. But we assume, I think our experience is that we're not just operating in a machine-like way when we do the right thing. Our sense of right and wrong is also accompanied by the feeling of right and wrong. In fact, that feeling of right and wrong, I'm assuming, preceded the writing of rules and laws. So in a sense, it's got these two components again: the rightness and the wrongness, expressible as a series of moral precepts, and then there's the feeling of right and wrong, which is our experience of that, our feeling of it. Okay, so what's that about? Yeah, I don't know. Just in terms of the just to draw out the parallel, which I've talked about in terms of the other things, there is a strong sense, I think, as well, that just like knowing and just like meaning, the feeling of morality and morality as it exists in laws and precepts are usually found together, but can drift apart or can be found completely separate and can exist completely separately. So, for example, let me have a think of this. Yeah, some of the more arcane and more complex laws, we kind of understand them as being rationally immoral, or rationally, we understand that the behaviour they refer to is rationally immoral and should be made illegal. And I think some of the crimes against corporations fall into that category. If you take a pen home from the office, it's very different to stealing a pen or it feels very different to stealing a pen out of someone's pocket, even though the action is broadly speaking the same. I know there are some distinctions, but broadly speaking it's the same activity. But one feels very different, or one just lacks that feeling component. It doesn't feel like a crime to take a pen home from the office or to download a piece of music, whereas it does feel like a crime to steal a pen from someone's desk, or to to go into HMV and just nick a CD off the shelf. So it is possible for these, for right and wrong to exist beyond or outside of or unaccompanied by the feeling of right and wrong. Conversely, it's certainly possible, I think, for right and wrong, the feeling of something being good and the feeling of something being morally wrong, even when the kind of logic of it, the rationality of it, can't be argued. There's a great example of that, I think. I can't remember where I read it, but it's a kind of test of moral understanding, where you tell this story and you ask people to describe the morality of it afterwards. And the story is that a brother and sister go on holiday together for the weekend. And they go camping and they have a great time. And on the Saturday night, they decide that just for an experiment, they'd like to see what it's like to have sex together, this brother and this sister. And so they do. Now they take proper precautions so as to make sure there's no risk of childbirth. They're both disease-free, so there's no risk of that being a problem. And they both have a great time. But the following day they decide that although it was a good time, they're not going to do it again. Not for any reasons of psychological damage. They just want to do other things. But it remains a warm memory for them for the rest of their lives, and they both look back on this moment of brotherly and sisterly sexual intimacy as a pleasant secret that they have together. So this story is told, and then we're asked to consider the morality of their brotherly and sisterly sex. Is it okay? And most people will say, no, that's morally wrong, or many people say it's morally wrong. When you ask them why, none of the reasons are obvious. None of the reasons that we would usually, the rationalisations that we would usually use are present. If you're using a purely utilitarian, balancing pleasures and pains type argument, that doesn't work, because neither of them suffered pain or any kind of psychological pain, and both of them have enjoyed the experience. In terms of consequences, you can't do that, because there's no children, no disease, nobody knows about it, so there's no kind of psychological consequences for anyone else. So any of the usual measures that we use for analysing and rationalising moral feelings are absent, and yet the feeling persists. Okay, I think that's all I've got to say on that right now. All I'm saying there really is that morality, the feeling of right and the feeling of wrong, correlates with those other feelings I've talked about, the feeling of knowing and the feeling of meaning, feeling of what happens next, has a similar structure. And the components of that structure, the rational kind of symbolic aspect of it, and the felt sense of it, seem to be able to exist independently. I think that makes sense.